What's up, guys? All right, this is going to be part two of the lecture. Let me get through this to where we left off. The way Screencastify works, you can't have large videos, so you have to do it in segments, unfortunately. So um, that will be the case. So there's going to be part one, part two, part three, all that kind of stuff. I think we left off city life and jazz age. Yeah. All right, so let's talk about women. Um, in the 1920s. All right, so ongoing crusade for equal rights. Women finally get the right to vote. I think I've talked about that plenty of times in class that white men were willing to give the right to vote to black men before they were to white women. So, what that says of us as a country, are we more sexist or are we more racist? Kind of interesting. Flappers. Flappers were women. They were typically young women, late teens, early 20s, who kind of broke out of the mold of what a woman was supposed to be at that time. They started cutting their hair shorter, started wearing shorter skirts, started revealing their shoulders, their legs, their wrists. They started going out to bars and restaurants and dancing, smoking cigarettes and drinking in public. Oh my God, all these things that women were typically not supposed to do. And obviously, the older generation couldn't believe it. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. And this was happening mostly in the cities. This is not happening out in the rural areas we talked about. That wouldn't have flown. In that case, the woman would probably leave the rural area and go to the city. Okay, but women start coming into their own at this time, and especially a lot of women during World War One who took care of all the responsibilities while the men were around, kind of found a new reason to exist, and not just to be um, a mom, not just to be a wife. Unfortunately, though, most women still remain in the domestic sphere, meaning they are at home. They're the housewife. One thing that does start to come around this time as well is the discovery of adolescence. Teenage children no longer need to work. Remember, for a very long time, children were kind of just seen as small adults, especially during tough times. Kids went out and worked. They were out in factories, coal mines, on the farm, all of that. All right. But kids are no longer expected to work. School starts to become a big deal. Compulsory education starts to come out where kids have to go to school. And they start living like kids again. The teenage mentality starts to come around. You're young, you're naive, you're starting to have fun, trying to figure out who you are. And that's really going to come to existence in the 1950s. Those of you who have seen the movies Hairspray and Grease, that kind of culture, the teenage culture, starts to um, arise. All right, so the Roaring Twenties, decade notable for obsessive interest in celebrities. This is kind of where the American culture of us being addicted to celebrity starts to come around. We can blame the 20s for the creation of the Kardashians, I guess. We watch TMZ and we have apps and stuff that we keep up with these celebrities, which is kind of ridiculous when I think about it, but it is what it is. Sex becomes an all consuming topic of interest in popular entertainment. The old adage for advertising, sex sells. This is where you start to see women starlets, actresses, who become the embodiment of what a woman apparently should be at the time. All right, but so we really start to the American culture as we know it today really starts to emerge in the 1920s. All right, alienation from the 20s mass culture, exiled Americas put U.S. in forefront of world literature. All right, so some of the greatest uh, what's it called? Authors are going to come out this time. T.S. Eliot, Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald. They started. A lot of these guys actually served in World War One, and they're going to have a different kind of take on the world. They're going to call themselves the Lost Generation because they just came out of all this terrible and horrible stuff, and they thought the world was pretty much ending. All right, but if you haven't read anything by them, Great Gatsby, Ernest Hemingway wrote Farewell to Arms, just really good stuff. Hopefully, you're reading that in your English classes. Then you have the Harlem Renaissance, which I wish we had more time to talk about, but I would definitely, if you're interested in stuff like that, read into a little bit more. You write about it in your textbook, and there's some pretty good videos out there that I'll post as well onto Schoology. But anyway, the Harlem Renaissance was a cool time because it was Harlem, New York. It was a section of New York City where whites had left, so African Americans had gone to. And it was a collection of African American writers and poets and artists and painters. And it was a really neat place. It was just a collective of ideas where African Americans came and started finding their own voice. They had their own restaurants and clubs. The ironic thing is, so many whites actually went into Harlem in the clubs to see people like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington, and pay money to see African Americans, yet they weren't allowed to. African Americans weren't allowed to go to their restaurants and their clubs. So I've said it before, all American music pretty much comes from African American music, rock and roll, blues, R&B, hip hop. That white society, white culture has always consumed. All right, but yeah, so you have some people like Langston Hughes, who writes some amazing stuff. Comes out, he writes a book called The New Negro, which talks about the emergence of the African American post Reconstruction, post slavery, and some pretty cool stuff. You have W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington come out with their plans on how they think African Americans should succeed, and kind of prove themselves to the white society at the time. So I'll post some videos about Harlem Renaissance on there, but definitely if you're interested in it, I would definitely look up some more stuff on that. Rural Americans identify urban culture with communism, crime, and immorality. Okay, so we have this um, fight between rural America and the cities. Okay, it's like two different cultures really happening. Rural Americans identify urban culture with communism, crime, and immorality, which I think still goes on today. You have these people in these small towns that still view the city as, they're dirty, they're filthy, it's crime there. There's sex, drugs, and rock and roll, which they might have a point, but at the same time, it's a different way of living. It's not everybody's in crime, not everybody's in morality. They're just living a different way. Um, Progressives, and you hear this term a lot today, especially people like Bernie Sanders, who are consider themselves progressive, attempt to force reform on the American people. Try to fix some of the things that were bad, and there's nothing wrong with that. There is an upsurge of bigotry at this time and an era of repression. You have a lot of immigrants coming into this country around this time. They're escaping if they didn't escape World War I already. World War I is Europe is pretty much ravaged, and they're trying to look for a better life like everybody else is. So there's going to be a lot of nativism that pops up again, and then you have era of repression, segregation, racism, Jim Crow laws, all that kind of stuff is still going on. So we're nowhere near out of that yet. Fear of radicalism. You know what, guys? I'm going to do this one on the next one because I'm at 8 minutes. All right. So hold tight.